And so may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. I'm in a different place today. I'm not at home and I'm not at the church. I'm visiting with some friends, and I'm very thankful to my friend Anne for giving me a space to be able to record this week's sermon. We live in an amazing age. Some might call it the age of information. We're surrounded by more information than we ever have been as human beings. We literally have information available at our fingertips. 5 years ago, there were 31 billion Google searches every month. Today, there are 5.6 billion searches every single day. And yet we don't seem able to translate that information into purpose or meaning for life. Those are not the kind of questions that you can look up on the internet and get Google to answer for you in 3.5 seconds. I think part of the problem is that there is a vast difference between information, knowledge, and wisdom. Information is accessible. If you have a readily accessible source, it's easy to get information. But wisdom, on the other hand, is something very different. Wisdom is like learning a skill. It's like developing a muscle memory that athletes and musicians strive to achieve in their practice routines. But that kind of memory, that muscle memory, doesn't happen overnight. It has to be learned and developed over time, repeated over and over and practiced until it becomes actually a part of us. I asked a few wise people in my life this week what they thought about wisdom, or if they had a great quote about wisdom, and I got some pretty interesting responses. Like, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in the fruit salad. Or, knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. I was also introduced to the spoken word song The Sunscreen by Buzz Luhrmann. I'd never heard of him or the song before, but it offered such sage wisdom as don't worry about the future, or worry, but know that worrying is as effective as trying to solve an algebra question by chewing bubblegum. The real trouble in your life is apt to be things that never cross your mind, the kind that blindside you at 4 p.m. on some idle Tuesday. Or do one thing that scares you every day. Sing. Don't be reckless with people's hearts. Don't put up with people who are reckless with your heart. And floss. All good pieces of wisdom. A younger generation offered the wisdom song by a comedian called Dimitri Martin, and he advises that we be careful of who we step on going up the ladder, because you will meet them on the way down. That you need to be a friend in order to have a friend, and that every organization takes on the characteristics of its leader. There's a story that I just love. It was first published in 1966 in the Reader's Digest magazine. It was called Information Please, and it might be something that is familiar to you. It's a story that I have heard many, many, many times, and yet it always touches my heart. It's the story of Paul, a young boy from the Pacific Northwest, and here's what he says. When I was quite young, my father had one of the first telephones in the neighborhood. I remember well the polished old case fastened to the wall. The shiny receiver hung on the side of the wooden box, and I was too little to reach the telephone, but I would listen with fascination when my mother talked into it. And I came to realize that somewhere inside that wonderful device lived an amazing person with the name Information Please, and there was nothing that she did not know. My first personal experience with this genie in the bottle came one day while my dad was at work and my mother was visiting a neighbor. Amusing myself at the tool bench in the basement, I whacked my thumb with a hammer. The pain was terrible, but there didn't seem to be any reason for crying out because there was no one at home to give me any sympathy. So I walked around the house, sucking on my throbbing thumb, and finally I arrived at the stairway and I saw the telephone. Quickly I ran for the footstool and I dragged it to the landing, and I climbed up and I unhooked the receiver and I held it to my ear and I said, "Information, please," desperately into the mouthpiece just above my head. A click or two later, a small, clear voice spoke into my ear. "Information," she answered. "I hurt my finger," I wailed into the phone, and the tears came readily enough now that I had an audience. "Is your mother home?" came the question. "Nobody's home but me," I blubbered. "Are you bleeding?" "No. I hit it with a hammer and now it hurts." "Can you open your icebox?" she asked, and I said that I could. "Well then, chip off a little piece of ice and hold it to your finger," said the voice. I did what she said, and my finger stopped hurting. After that, I called "Information, please" for everything. I asked for help with my geography, and she told me where Philadelphia was located. She helped me with my math. She told me that my pet chipmunk, which I had caught in the park just the day before, would eat fruit and nuts. And then there was the time when Petey, our pet canary, died. I called "Information," and I told her the sad story. She listened, and then said the usual things grown-ups say to try and soothe a child. But I was unconsoled, and I asked her, why is it that birdies should sing so beautifully and bring joy to all families, only to end up in a heap? She must have sensed my deep concern, for she said quietly, "Paul, always remember that there is another world to sing in." And somehow I felt better. When Paul was 9 years old, he moved across the country to Boston, and he missed his friend very much. As he grew into his teens, the memories of those childhood conversations never really left him. And in moments of doubt and perplexity, he would recall that sense of serenity that he had, and how patient and understanding and kind she was to have spent all that time on a little boy. A few years later, Paul was heading west to college, and he stopped at the airport in Seattle, and he says, "I had half an hour before my plane was set to arrive. I spent 15 minutes on the phone with my sister, who lived there now, and then out of the blue I decided to dial my hometown operator, and I found myself saying, 'Information, please.' Miraculously, I heard a small, clear voice that I knew so well. 'Information,' she replied. I hadn't planned on this, but I heard myself saying, 'Can you tell me how to spell fix?' which was a question that I had asked her so many years ago. There was a long pause, and then came the soft-spoken answer, 'I guess your finger must have healed by now.' I laughed. 'So it really is still you,' I said. 'I wonder if you have any idea how much you meant to me during that time.' 'I wonder,' she said, 'if you know how much your calls meant to me. I never had children, and I used to look forward to all of your calls.' I told her how I often thought of her over the years, and I asked her if I could call her again when I was back that way to visit my sister. 'Please do,' she said. 'Just ask for Sally.' Well, 3 months later, Paul was back in Seattle, and he called "Information" again, but a different voice answered. 'Information?' I asked. 'Could I speak with Sally?' 'Are you a friend?' she asked. 'Yes, a very old friend,' I answered. 'I'm sorry to have to tell you this,' she said. 'Sally's just been working part-time for the last few years because she was sick. She died 5 weeks ago.' Before I could hang up, she said, 'Wait a minute. Did you say your name was Paul?' 'Yes,' he answered. 'Well, Sally left a message for you. She wrote it down just in case you would call. Let me read it to you. The note says, "Tell him that I still say there is another world to sing in." He'll know what I mean.'" I thanked her, and I hung up the phone, for I knew what Sally meant. Sally was much more than information to Paul, and she offered so much more than knowledge. By the choices that she made to engage a young boy rather than scold him for wasting her time or hanging up on him, Sally chose the wise path, and they were both rewarded for that effort. She was what I might call a wise one. She knew what was important, and she invested her time accordingly, at least with Paul anyway. She acted with good sense. She knew that every moment counts and that there is always time to offer ourselves to someone else. She knew what the Lord wanted her to do, and I believe that she was filled with the Spirit. Living wisely for the author of Ephesians mean that we live a life that is integrated with the Spirit, that is mindful and intentional. Wisdom teaches us that even in the midst of the most challenging of times, even in the midst of struggle, that we can sing and offer our praise to the Holy One. We do this because beneath the challenges of life, there is an undercurrent of grace that invites us to experience the presence of the Holy regardless of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I believe that Sally offered that grace to young Paul. And doing so, those moments they had together, those conversations became something holy, something sacred. Those who live by knowledge live in the moment, a good moment or a bad moment, and their happiness depends on success and achievement and desire and consumption and peer approval. Wise people see their lives from a different perspective, one that is grounded in the knowledge that we are loved by God, that we are accompanied by God, that we are upheld and encouraged and comforted by God, and challenged to love others. Remember those wise ones I checked in with this week? One line stood out for me from among all the pieces of wisdom that they offered, and there were far more than I shared with you today. Every organization takes on the characteristics of its leader. I think that's what this letter to the early church is concerned about. Paul would far rather the character of the church in Ephesus reflect Jesus Christ than the world around them. Grace-filled, concerned for the other, mindful, intentional, dedicating ourselves to thanksgiving, to praising God, to behaving ethically, to practicing our faith and worshiping with joy. Maybe this letter is the early church's call to St. Paul, asking for information, please. May it transform our lives this day, so many years later. Amen.